you very much. It's an honor to be here. And I'm very grateful to these interdisciplinary conferences that allow for perhaps different voices and a bit of a debate.
You don't need it. No, but something is in the...
With the microphone?
No. There is a technical problem, we'll fix it in a minute. No. Okay, sit down. Okay, go ahead.
When asking Sam, a 27-year-old Cambodian Canadian, whether he thought he and his parents were suffering from the long-term effects of trauma, he answered critically, "My family's strength that prevails above all else leads me to believe that the effects of trauma are negligible. Trauma is like Atkins' diet 2.0. It's just the next fad." Simon, an Israeli trauma descendant, told me that his therapist thought that his recent divorce might be related to his parents' Holocaust past, but then shocked me when he grinned and said that placing the Holocaust at the center of his life story could just be decoration and a good story. "If someone will offer me another story," he said, "or a better tool for happiness, I'll take it. I can be the perfect postmodern man with many possible stories. All of them might be true." Foundational paradigms in psychology and Holocaust and genocide studies have asserted that trauma descendants share in common a legacy of PTSD-related psychosocial scars and childhood memories of a familial conspiracy of silence. According to the above epistemologies, trauma descendants are thought to suffer parental repression and/or denial of a violent past, and in certain contexts, such as the socio-political silencing of parental testimonies, an absence of articulated accounts of the familial past. Mental health professionals, genocide scholars, and political activists alike call our attention to descendants' commitment to psychological working through and the voicing of silenced familial narratives of suffering, and their desire to contribute to public forms of commemoration. This descendant redemptive voice, according to the discourse, is often dependent upon the intervention of expert culture brokers, the therapist, political activist, historian, or even the anthropologist like myself. As these expert culture brokers seek to treat or redeem the silent voice of trauma descendants, offering them what the descendants above term Atkins' diet or a good story, one might ask, what do we actually know about the everyday childhood and adult lived experience of trauma descendants? As an anthropologist and a phenomenologist, this is what I seek. I need to emphasize here. Does their legacy, as they have phenomenologically experienced and lived it, entail the emotional wounding of transmitted PTSD? Again, I don't diagnose. I attempt to evaluate and listen to the lived experience as they perceive it. Was their experience of childhood one of onerous silence regarding the parental past? Or is it possible that silence was accepted as a culturally normative form of forgetting? Were there other channels of remembrance, other forms of silent transmission that left non-pathological traces of the past in terms of how they understand pathology, interwoven in the social milieu of everyday life? Finally, I ask, do descendants wish to publicly commemorate their violent histories? In order to grapple with the above questions, a comparative ethnographic study was undertaken of 25 Cambodian Canadian descendants of genocide living in Montreal and Toronto, Canada, and 55 Jewish Holocaust descendants living in Israel. For those who do not know the history, between 1975 and 1979, approximately 2 million Cambodians were killed, died of starvation or illness during the Khmer Rouge regime. In-depth ethnographic interviews were conducted using a semi-structured and thematic format. Findings challenged the underlying theoretical assumptions of the literature. Both Israeli and Khmer trauma descendants reject the pathological profile of transmitted PTSD. Although Israeli descendants do depict what they describe as a non-pathological emotional wound or mark of emotional difference, although both groups describe a predominantly silent home life, they depict alternative channels of memory and the presence and not absence of the genocide past in everyday life. The Holocaust descendants depict nonverbal presence in the form of parent-child face work. A descendant empathically observes as the survivor silently reminisces about the Holocaust past. Embodied practices, for example, laying one's shoes out before one goes to sleep in the case they would be taken away in the middle of the night. Person-object interaction with surviving photos, for instance, or a spoon from Auschwitz, embodying the past with a spoon from Auschwitz. The Khmer recount only partially verbal forms of presence in the form of fragmentary dicta, or brief one-sentences survivor references to horrific conditions they withstood. And the second form of partially verbal presence is fragmentary tales of parental survival. These tales embed genocide-related ideal modes of being or moral values that are embedded in these tales that are transmitted to the descendants. Both groups avoid active participation in public monumental forms of commemoration, whereas the Khmer express critique of commemorative projects in favor of a forward-looking worldview, and I think of what Ruth Golan said previously. It is proposed that differing Jewish-Israeli culture-specific attitudes regarding the centrality of memory in everyday life and Buddhist-Cambodian cultural attitudes regarding the marginality of memory work in everyday life that are shaped in part by distinct political and historical contexts account for divergent legacies. And for some examples of data. Beginning with the domestic silence, both Israeli and Khmer descendants recount parental silence surrounding the genocidal past, and both groups chose to respect survivor silence. Differences, however, emerge in the self-attributed reasons for this choice, with Cambodians appealing to culture-specific, in their words, Asian or Khmer silence, and Israeli Jews relating to more universal interpersonal concerns for parental well-being. Penny, a Cambodian descendant, explains her response to her parents' silence as follows. They don't bring it up and we don't ask questions. I don't think they want to get into it. My people don't talk about suffering, cry, or show emotions. To allow for the passage of life is a Cambodian way of living. You just be. Sam, too, explains why questioning the parent goes against the grain of Khmer cultural values. We Cambodians don't like to speak about the past, especially if you experienced bad things, you keep it inside. We don't share anything private, and if you do, it's only in the family. And even within the family, not much. If it comes up, we just listened. Asking him if he ever considered asking questions, he replied, "For a mind to indulge in such misery does not breed the kind of attitude the Khmers have. Khmers are strong, proud, forgiving, but not forgetful." Considering the above responses, we might ask, don't Khmer cultural norms regarding the articulation of emotion and suffering and Israeli respectful avoidance promote forgetting and absence? Or did descendants experience alternative forms of genocidal presence and transmission? Other forms of silent testimony, perhaps, that will be an open discussion, perhaps, later. As described above, Israeli descendants depicted a complex matrix of silent parent-child facework, parent-child interaction with surviving objects, or food health-related embodied practices of survival, all forms of nonverbal embodied and emotive presence and transmission of the past. Batya recounts as follows. Sometimes I would follow my father into the bedroom. The drawer in his dresser was his secret place where he kept things close to his heart. He would open the drawer and begin taking out a picture of himself with his parents from before the war and a collection of toys he had salvaged from his childhood. The minute he opened the drawer, his face changed. He became softer, more gentle, and more alive. In our everyday life, he was a zombie. You could see the death in his eyes. But when he opened the drawer and took out his things, it was like he was taken back to his life before the Holocaust, to his childhood. He played with his magnets, smiled at his family in the picture. The drawer for me was like an enchanted forest, because I could be with the person I really never knew. We would sit together on his bed while he played with his things. It was really intimate. He never told me anything about the toys or the people in the picture. There was no story. But by the way he acted like a child and the way he wouldn't let any of us open the drawer ourselves or touch his things, we knew he was back there. So different, so alive, we had to realize that his life with us was not real to him because he never really left his past. If we were to use a psychological frame to interpret Batya's narrative, we might conclude that the descendant was not only the victim of her father's everyday traumatic numbness, but that even when he appeared to come alive, when reenacting his childhood past, he failed to provide narrative tales of his childhood or to allow his daughter to actively play with him in his virtual world. The encounter provided no verbal interaction and would allow to access a story or even an embodied memory of this past or his absent self. However, before diagnosing Batya as the victim of her father's traumatic past, let us explore her experience from her lay perspective as she perceives and narrates it. Batya's narrative truth, if you will. Despite their silence, Batya claims that her moments with her father allowed her to enter his enchanted forest, to be with the person she never really knew, and to share in the intimacy of his playful imaginary world, to be with him in his distant past. By no means belittling the challenge of relating to and interacting with the zombie that he was during the great majority of her childhood, Batya nonetheless paints a dual picture of both parental emotional absence alongside moments of intense emotional presence and empathic sharing when he opened up. The text calls upon us to move beyond psychological and popular cultural frames of intergenerational dysfunctional silence to uncover the underlying silent connection, interaction, and communication. It illustrates the way silence did not preserve absence or prevent emotive interaction, but rather functioned as a gateway into the past, into the otherwise sublime death world and lost pre-war life world. It allowed for what Halbach termed lived memory in everyday life. I would add emotive and embodied memory instead of narrativized memory, and perhaps an open question whether we would need to reconsider the concept of post-memory or identity theft. Here, Marianne Hirsch, Anderson, concepts of the danger of this kind of identification, perhaps transposition. In contrast to Holocaust descendants, the great majority of Cambodian descendants do not depict a matrix of silent genocidal presence in the Cambodian home. However, despite the overall silence in survivor homes, both groups of descendants recount their parents' sporadic, fragmentary verbal references to their genocidal experiences. Verbal references took two different forms. The first, dicta or brief one-sentence survivor references. One example, David, for example, recalls coming home after school. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, and complaining that he was starving and wanted something to eat. His father would respond, "You think you're hungry, you don't know what hunger is." Survivor fragmentary tales recounting near-death experiences in their battles of survival engendered family scripts, which, according to descendants, embedded and transmitted valorized key scenarios and values central to the sense of self and mode of being. Sean recalls his mother's tale as follows. "My mother would tell me, 'You think you're tough, but if I dump you in the woods, you wouldn't last a day because you wouldn't know what to do. I've lived in those camps. I know what it's like to eat grasshoppers. I know what it feels like to have bombs falling down next to you. I know what it's like to watch a kid die in front of you, see kids deserted on the road, and you want to pick them up, but you can't because you need to watch out for your own. So that's why you need to keep working hard. A couple of days ago, my mom fought with my sister. She nagged at me that I don't help her with my sister. Now that I'm older, I think I understand now that you got to work hard and watch out for your own. Betty's mythic tales unfolds as follows, another Khmer descendant. My mom told me how my father was killed, her parents, 2 sisters, and a brother all in one day. She was pregnant with me and wanted to die, but she knew she had to struggle to survive for my sake. She told me she had to pretend to be illiterate so the Khmer Rouge wouldn't kill her, and she dirtied her face so they wouldn't see how white she was. After that, you realize how life is precious and you appreciate every moment. Both groups were asked whether they felt that the genocide had defined their sense of self and view of the world. As reflected in the dicta and mythic tales, the Khmer highlighted their view of the ideal self as stoic, hardworking, and committed to their families. Like Sean and Petty above, Holocaust descendants voiced their appreciation of life and family ties, but also asserted that they could not help be wary of those who may wish them ill and sense an existential loneliness. There is thus no doubt that the silent and partially verbal presence of the past in the survivor home constituted descendant ideational genocide legacies. Returning to the claims of the literature, one might ask if the above silent and partially silent presence did not transmit some form of psychological wound or the transmitted effect of parental PTSD. Although a good number of Israeli descendants and some of the Khmer did consider their parents as suffering from PTSD-related symptoms, all descendants insisted that their parents were highly resilient and did not require therapy. Although the Israeli group did say in the spirit of self-parody that they themselves were a bit sarut, scratched, or in English slang equivalent, touched. Both groups claimed that they were not suffering from transmitted PTSD. Most interesting, however, were the Khmer's lengthy references to Cambodian culture, specifically Buddhism, as a source of resilience, or what we might call cultural protective layer. Ken explains, Buddhism tells us that suffering is a part of life. This helped my father get over his experience. Belief systems like Buddhism are meant to strengthen people and help them succeed. Sam, too, was insightful on the topic of trauma and transmitted trauma and its link to Buddhism. The literature talks about these people, survivors, as victims who have been traumatized, and that they're sick and miserable. I felt that these people were really strong and healthy, and not weak or sick. After they survived, it made them even stronger. Like my father said during the Y2K period, the hysteria around the year 2000, nothing could beat me now. I lived through much worse. I can survive on almost no food. I've done it before. I can do it again. So I think that they were really resilient, strong enough to start their lives again. Regarding the future intergenerational legacy of their genocidal pasts, the older Israeli descendants had relinquished the task of transmission to public culture brokers, primarily in the school system, but insisted that commemoration was their children's, the third generation's, essential moral obligation. Referring to Jewish traditional paradigms and practices of memory, one descendant explained, like what we say on Passover, that we tell from generation to generation, descendants will have to salvage the stories of the survivors and make sure no one forgets what happened. In great contrast, the Khmer expressed disinterest in and at times even critique of the call to transmit their legacy to future generations and provide public testimony to the genocide as follows. Now, if I have children who are as inquiring as me, then I'm pretty sure they will discover what happened in the past. But none of this is relevant to the situation they, my children, are in, and also it does nothing in terms of making them better people. What we ought to do is learn to love them and pass down the virtues that were taken from our parents as it pertains to the situations related to the war. It is important for the genocide, to remain in history, but not to be reflected on in the future. A future remembered in good nature is better than a forgotten past reflected upon in sorrow. Tracing the roots of his views in Buddhism, Sam explains, I think the mentality, the way you live your life in general, affects how you experience suffering. They, the survivors, believe in karma, so they believe the fact that it happened, your suffering or death, is an effect of natural causes. They accept what happened to them, not being angry, bitter, or vengeful. It's horrible, but we must move on because it's just a matter of karma. To sum up, This comparative study of Cambodian, Canadian, and Israeli Holocaust trauma survivors set out to evaluate the similarities and differences of trauma-descendant lay lived experience of intergenerational transmission of genocidal legacies. The comparison of the two samples yielded significant differences in the perceived presence or absence of the transmitted past in everyday life, the mechanisms with which that presence is maintained or limited, the perceived content and cultural meaning attributed to that presence, and finally the future trajectory of the desired or the not desired or the absence of the transmission of the past. Despite the obvious importance of divergent socioeconomic and political contexts, and unfortunately I can't discuss these very important factors, Descendant accounts of their very different experience points to the constitutive role of culture in shaping the contours of descendant memory work. In other words, the experience and meaning of suffering and the value of silence, memory, and testimony or forgetting are culturally constituted and mediated. Having highlighted culturally specific paradigms and practices of memory, this study problematizes the scholarship and therapeutic political practices that often conceptualize and treat trauma-descendant experience as universal. In keeping with Didier Fassin's critique of the universal semiotics of suffering and victimhood, this study calls for further exploration of the culturally particular responses to what we have classified as potentially traumatizing events. Although recent psychological literature has turned extensive attention to resilience and culturally particular layers, culturally particular protective layers, such as religious worldviews, the majority of academic and popular cultural accounts present trauma victims and their descendants as psychosocially wounded and essentially vulnerable, while paying insufficient, in my view, attention to more positive characteristics such as strength of spirit, human endurance, hope, and sacrifice for significant others. The data allows us to consider not only the ways in which these empowering legacies have been tacitly transmitted in everyday life, but also how diverse responses to genocide, thus far conflated under the rubric of traumatic experience, may have constituted microcultures with culture-specific values, practices, and modes of being. Both case studies may also serve to highlight the general importance of a closer reading of culture-specific conceptualizations of selfhood, personal and collective suffering, memory, history, and the way in which these conceptualizations enable or limit memory work. Despite the extensive ethnographic accounts of culture-bound illnesses, healing, and related belief systems, the cross-cultural studies of collective memory, there have been few attempts to examine the way culture-specific conceptualizations of self, illness, or memory constitute unique mechanisms of transmission, be they verbal, embodied, or ideational. The above comparative study problematizes the taken-for-granted dichotomy of remembering and forgetting. In the Israeli group, alternative forms of nonverbal interaction imply that the commemoration of genocidal death worlds are interwoven, not absent, in the everyday life world of the family, rather than forgotten. Although the Khmer study signifies a more conventional reading of cultural forgetting, here too a transmitted genocide-related worldview and mode of being present alternative channels of transmitted memory. This form of remembering the past may not contribute to monumental testimonial commemorative projects, but it is nevertheless a legacy that challenges our concept of remembrance and forgetting. As mental health professionals work with survivors and their descendants around the globe, and memory workers establish commemorative projects like the new projects that are being established now, collective sites of memory in Cambodia, introducing Western forms of talk therapy and testimony, the above findings point once again to the importance of culturally sensitive conceptualizations of illness, healing, and memory. Further comparative studies are called for so that lessons learned from victims of genocide may sensitize those who seek to interpret, heal, historicize, and liberate silent voices of genocide.
Thank you, Carol Kidron, for such a concise, clear, but very nuanced presentation. And we are open for questions. Yes.
Does your study take into account the issues of immigration? Was that the role being a second generation Israeli or Ashkenazi is not the same as being a second generation Asian Canadian.
Absolutely, and that was why I mentioned, unfortunately, that there isn't enough time to take those differences into account. That's the question of the sociopolitical context. I can just say that one of the reasons why I'm certain the Cambodians were so open about Buddhism when they were discussing their legacies was because that they were becoming conscious of difference within the context of immigration. And I spent 2 months this summer in Cambodia interviewing Cambodian descendants. And of course, they were not reflexive about Buddhism in the way the Cambodian Canadians were. So that's very important. And for sure, in the multicultural context of Canada, the Cambodians are still trying to work out whether they're Canadian or Cambodian and why. So definitely this is an important point, and it is part of my research, but no time for this today. Thank you.
Thanks for that brilliant presentation. I'd like you to expand on two things. One, in the U.S., resilience has become a kind of cliche, and often times just meant something like the absence of PTSD. I wonder if you could deepen our understanding. I believe it's more than that, but I wonder if you could share some more thoughts about what you learned about resilience in your project, one.
Okay.
Two is, can you say something more about who are the public culture brokers and what do they do?
This is so that I'll be stoned, right? This is... okay, so about resilience, I have to say that I'm now presently trying to work on a paper about cultural protective layers. So what I can say that I learned was that despite the fact that Cambodians in Canada, and I can add now in Cambodia, were exposed to their parents' numbness and to silence, they interpret that sadness in ways that they define as still empowering. Because, for instance, they say that in our culture, the idiom is that we can't allow our parents to think too much. And actually, thinking too much is a Cambodian idiom. And the solution to thinking too much is to divert somebody you love from depressive thinking and help them feel loved and cared for and help them feel that there's an environment where they're contained. So their answer is, why would I want to speak to them about the past? That would push them into thinking too much, and they would be sad. So I have to interpret what sadness means for a Cambodian, when for us it means something entirely different. And especially if you ask about resilience, perhaps for Jewish descendants, speaking about your past as a second or third generation gives you a sense of resilience because you're doing something culturally meaningful. According to Jewish paradigms, it's meaningful to talk about your painful past. And it's a badge of honor. That's what many of the people I spoke to call it. For the Cambodians, it's absolutely not a badge of honor. The honor is to be strong and to move forward with the moral values of the genocide. So that, for me, is how I understand it, although I don't really... I would say something about the psychological discourse I've been reading about resilience. I don't remember particularly if it's American, but I would say very carefully that I would say that culturally speaking, resilience still defines the self as vulnerable. And I'm not certain that all cultures experience the self as vulnerable, but I cannot support this yet, but that I hope in 5-6 years' time maybe I'll have more to say. And about culture brokers, I would also say very carefully that I've met people in Cambodia from NGOs who have 1 week training in psychology and who are teaching people how to do talk therapy and give testimony. And that, to me, is a culture broker that has a problem. And I'm wondering, if you give people narratives, they learn them. We learn quickly. So I'm worried about what kind of narratives people are learning about themselves. So I don't want to give up my narratives. I don't think other people should give up theirs. So that's my agenda.
Last question.
I wonder if you could say more about the circumstances that got the story launched. And you described what happened in Cambodia as a genocide. I think it's a misnomer. It doesn't apply well to the phenomena. This was something quite self-inflicted. And there must be, possibly, there's guilt involved. Mm-hmm. The Universalistic project, very much unlike the Holocaust, which was about Aviv. Yeah. How does that play itself out in terms of the heritage later?
Okay. This is a huge problem in everything I've written. Some reviewer comments that I'm misnaming the event. It is considered very sensitive and a leftover of post-colonialism to call it auto-genocide, because to say that they killed themselves as opposed to us having a demonic other doesn't solve the problem of their experience of suffering, and they just call it the terrible time of Pol Pot, in which many people suffered. I mean, till this day, their neighbors are ex-Khmer Rouge. So this is an ideological political event that does not fit our classification system. That's all. And then we can still talk, I believe, about common and uncommon trajectories of how we deal with the past and memory and suffering. But this is a huge problem in terms of how we speak. So we're looking for, it's again Fassan's universal semiotics, because we want to call it the same thing. Why can't we call Holocaust genocide? This in the Holocaust and genocide community in Israel, this is a huge debate. Why do we need Holocaust and genocide studies? So that's an endless question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And